Narrated by Davy Wreden, a name you might recognize from his work on the Stanley Parable, The Beginner's Guide leads the player through a series of small games made by another developer, Coda, broken down into a total of 17 chapters. The games are short, usually unfinished, and some aren't really games at all. Davy presents the games chronologically, telling the story of the relationship between himself and Coda by providing interpretations of the abstract games and inviting players to devise their own. Davy is our narrator, the guide through these glimpses into Coda's mind. Right from the start, he presents himself in an incredibly personable light, even inviting players to email him if they want to talk about any of the games. As it progresses, though, it becomes clearer and clearer that Davy isn't necessarily as friendly to Coda or as truthful to the player as he makes himself out to be. Davy is portrayed as being infatuated, almost obsessed with getting external validation from others, and not really opposed to crossing moral boundaries if the ends, to him, justify the means. Coda, on the other hand, is never directly interacted with by the player. All of his thoughts are communicated through these games, which it's important to remember were never intended to be shown to anyone. Through Davy's interpretations, he's portrayed as being introverted, almost recluse, and is assumed by Davy to be struggling with mental illness. The Beginner's Guide is a series of games developed by Coda that the player is dropped into in their chronological order. They are, for the most part, very short, just intending to have something to say or creating a feeling or an environment, more so than being a game in the traditional sense. The games are things like a set of stairs leading to a room filled with game ideas that the player could never reach, or an environment supposedly connected to the internet, populated with comments from other players that really have all come from Coda. Many of them aren't even really playable at all, doing things like forcing the player to stay in a prison for hours before the game can move on. In cases like these, Davy usually steps in and changes some stuff around so we can actually get through the game. He admits to going in and changing the games a few times, but there are some changes he may have made to sort of confirm his suspected narrative that are alluded to but never admitted. Davy talks about what he sees in these games and paints a picture of Coda at the same time. He'll often give these really beautiful and profound meanings for the games, which, from what the player is shown, do make sense. The symbolism he finds and the conclusions he draws don't come out of nowhere, and with so many of them alluding to a person really struggling creatively, it creates a genuine concern for Coda. All of this depiction comes to a peak in the penultimate chapter, a game where the player is interrogating a machine called Coda, ending with the player revisiting all the previous game environments and literally destroying them. This sparks a lot of concern in Davy.
I'm thinking that Code is stuck in his own head, and that it's having a very negative effect on him, and that all he needs to do is just start showing his work to people, to get some actual feedback on his games. It might get him out of isolation. And so, as I'm thinking this, I realize that I could be the one to initiate it.
At this point, it becomes really clear just how reliant Davy is on external approval.
Can you see why I felt like this was the right thing to do? Because it's the thing that I always feel like I need, to be told that my work is good, that I am good. When someone really connects with a thing that I've made, when they see themselves purely in my work, there's nothing that feels better. And I got to give that very same feeling to my friend. I did something... I really felt like I'd done something good, like I was a good person. I felt like there was a friend who was in trouble and was unhappy and maybe didn't like themselves, and I could fix it. If I could give him this gift, maybe I could fix the problem.
The next chapter, The Tower, is supposedly the last game ever made by Coda, or at least the last one Davy was ever made aware of. This game is a direct message from Coda to Davy, asking him to cut off contact. It becomes revealed here that Davy was not the friend to Coda he thought himself to be. Coda really was content in his creations, and they were just for him. By pushing on these boundaries, by looking desperately for meaning, and by sharing the work, Davy was really harshly breaking Coda's boundaries and invading his personal space.
I don't think I ever told you this, but when I took your work and I was showing it to people, it actually felt... It felt as though I were responsible for something important and valuable. And the people who played them, they treated me like I was important. They really listened and cared about what I had to say. Even though I was showing your work, I felt good about myself. Finally. For a moment, while I had that, I liked myself.
Even in creating the beginner's guide, he's still breaking those boundaries, and in a way the player is complicit for participating at all. It completely reframes the previous chapters, and it becomes clear that Davy's intentions were never pure. He was never seeing Coda as a friend. He wasn't doing these things to help Coda. He was doing them because they made him feel better about himself. This whole time, Davy's been so desperate to make himself feel complete, to find some problem to fix, that he'll gladly create one. The beginner's guide closes out with a short sequence reminiscent of the very first game, a space shooter, in which the player goes through a short maze before sacrificing themselves to save their crewmates. In this rendition, when the player sacrifices themselves by walking into this beam, they're elevated up above the map and can see this full expansive maze. Davy is gone, and for the first time since the game began, the player is really alone, and free to come to their own conclusions about the scene. It's a really beautiful moment, and a perfect ending to such a tumultuous experience. The player is totally free to dive into all of this symbolism, looking for meaning, but it also really fosters the potential for players to just sit and observe and bask in the scene before them. Maybe there is meaning there, maybe there isn't, and maybe it just isn't for us to know. Though the game portrays the narrative as being non-fictional, there are some obvious problems with the idea of uploading another person's entire collection of work without their consent and charging $10.99 for it on Steam. Since the game came out, people have theorized that Coda is really just a personification of Davy's own creative mind. Regardless to interpretations, it was confirmed by Davy on a podcast in 2018 that Coda is a fictional character. The Beginner's Guide does a really excellent job of immersing the player into this relationship, really showing the story from Davy's perspective. It can be hard to keep in mind that Davy's changing these games, that these games weren't made for us. We weren't ever meant to see them, and we don't know Coda at all. We have no basis upon which to really take Davy's word on anything, no reason to trust his interpretations of these games that aren't for him. Yet the reveal at the end is still so transformative and shocking. It immediately shifts the player's perspective from when aligned with Davy to when aligned with Coda. It's so well executed, and a fantastic example of an unreliable narrator that doesn't always feel that way to the audience. The Beginner's Guide is also a really interesting example of a piece of interactive media that misses a lot of really key features of games. The story is very linear, there's really no player agency, and the game can be won or lost, but the story could still never exist nearly as effectively in anything other than a game format. On the other hand, with Davy's continual presence and commentary, the game does have a habit of falling into the trope of telling rather than showing. Some of Davy's interpretations feel a bit forced, and his bluntness with his own thoughts and feelings take away some of the subtlety at times. The Beginner's Guide is a fantastic example of something with no real goal, no outcome valorization, no win or lose condition that still could not exist as anything other than a game. It's such an immersive and resonating narrative that challenges the player's perception and expertly translates the character's emotions onto the player. Ultimately, The Beginner's Guide is whatever you choose to make of it, and similarly, it will never be what you've made it to be. Thank you so much for listening.